like to honour the men and the women, the great philosophical thinkers, forefathers and mothers, who have laid the foundations upon which we've developed the schools of psychological thought over the last few hundred years. This fine gentleman here is a carving of Plato. Plato being an ancient Greek philosopher who lived between 427 and 347 BC, before Christ. Now, Plato was interested in moral philosophy, all right? Not so much in human behaviour, but he looked at what it actually takes to live a good life. And this was some of the questions that many of the philosophers would ask back then. Very different from some of the questions that many people throughout modern day society ask. How do I be more successful? How do I make more money? How do I get more stuff? How do I get ahead in life? How do I grow in knowledge? How do I grow in understanding? Back then, how do I live a good life? Very different questions. So this was the essence of moral philosophy. Plato actually despised natural philosophy, and that's what today has become known as science. As he saw it as an inferior and unworthy sort of knowledge. Now, I guess that Plato kind of saw human beings as being more than just flesh and bones. He saw them as being more than just DNA or a component of their parts, all right? Which is what some schools of thought would define us as being, especially the biological school of thought. Now, this certainly isn't a school of thought that I would be building into modern applied psychology. Now, whilst some textbooks and some references might say that biological psychology is a school of psychological thought, we must question how accurate this is, all right? I mean, think about it. Think about how it is that you like being put in a box. Think about how much you like being squeezed into a perspective. Think about how much you enjoy being squeezed into someone else's definition of who you are. I guess that doesn't give us much wiggle room or space to grow and expand or develop in life. And if you think about what the scientific approach does, science looks to explain that which is. So say, for example, you could take the scientific school of biology and or anatomy. We look to understand the human body. Now, medicine has come from this. So if something goes wrong with the physical body, if something goes wrong with the brain, you can be given medication, and some medications will resolve physical, biological issues. But let me just remind you what philosophy and what psychology was actually always about. It was about understanding human behaviour, all right? Not from a biological perspective, but from a place of intrigue, all right? We want to understand why human beings do what they do, because I guess what we cannot determine are our own biological factors. We cannot determine how our brain functions. This is something beyond our control. But what if we can learn to manage our thoughts? What happens if we can learn to manage our emotions? What happens if it is possible to learn and grow and change and evolve in any direction that we want to in life? Well, these are the questions that Plato was asking. He believed that human beings are born with complete knowledge within our eternal soul. Now, we've got to understand what soul meant and the terms of how Plato was applying it, because back then, Plato saw the soul as being a culmination of our mind, our free will, and our emotions. Now, there's obviously many ways that this core idea is communicated and presented today, but back then, this one simple idea, Plato defined the mind as being very different from the organ of the brain. All right, he saw the mind as being a whole new entity. Now, this isn't about you agreeing or disagreeing or having your own philosophy, all right? This is about exploring the foundations of psychology as a study of human life, all right? So, he said that we're born with complete knowledge within our eternal soul, but what may he have meant about this? Well, come on, regardless of what our perspective is, regardless of what our preferences is, we all fundamentally know the difference between right and wrong. We know which of our actions are good, we know which of our actions are bad, we know which of our actions and our attitudes are completely selfish and rotten, and we know which ones are good and altruistic by nature. But yet many people go through life sometimes a little bit numb to this, But just because we're numb to something doesn't mean that something isn't there, all right? And this was the idea that Plato bought into. He believed that human beings are born with complete knowledge within our eternal soul. You know, when we're presented with an idea or a concept or a notion, and then we say, oh, yeah, that's right. And how is it specifically that we know something is right or wrong? If I was to say to you right now that human beings are born up in the clouds and they're brought from heaven down to earth via storks, what would you say? You'd say, Kane, that's nonsense. What are you saying that for? That's like crazy talk. We know that, there's biological factors come into play. A man and a woman sleep. They, sperm fertilizes an egg and then egg produces baby. But the factors that we suggested earlier on come back into play. The principle of the harvest. Man can plant a seed, he can water a seed, but he cannot make the seed grow. All right, so we've got to acknowledge the factors that are in our control and the factors that are not in our control. What is the point of focusing in on studying and researching factors of the human experience that are outside of our control? Because if factors are outside of our control, then we cannot influence them. But if there's factors that are in our control, then we can influence and we can grow and we can change. All right, so we know what is true within our soul. If I was to say to you right now, you know that you have the potential to be so much more in life than who you're currently being. It doesn't matter what stage of development you're at, you have the potential to be so much more. You're going to be nodding your head in agreement because you fundamentally know this is true. But then if I was to say to you, there's nothing else in this world for you to know, you know this isn't true. Although sometimes we're numbed to these truths, so sometimes we fall victim to the notion that we do know it all, all right? Which is why we sometimes go on the defensive and protect that which we think we know. Plato believed that true learning is a process of abstract thinking, inner reflection and contemplation for the purposes of discovering that which is true within us. All right, I'm guessing that Plato might perhaps be an advocate of the wise mind model, not the academic approach that many people take towards delivering information and ideas today. So, Aristotle, he was a student of Plato who identified a connection between the mind, the body, and the soul. But what was it? Who knows? All right, what I want to do here, I want to share with you a story, if that's okay. And this is a story that I've taken from one of Plato's most popular writings, the Republic. The Republic is a series of conversations. There's a few analogies in there, and this is just one of them. What Plato is given reference to here is our ability and willingness to communicate that which we're learning, right? This is a picture of learning. So as this story goes, the human race is kind of like a community of people living in a cave. Right? Now, this community of people who are living in a cave are bound by their wrists, they're bound by their ankles, by shackles, and those shackles are bound to the concrete floor of the cave. Now, they can't move. There's a wall directly behind them, and they can't see anything behind this wall because they're bound to the floor. All they can see is that which is directly in front of them. This is their perspective. This is their outlook on life. Now, all they can see, shadows and silhouettes, but because they've never seen anything else, they perceive and believe these things to be real things. What they are not aware of is the fact that we have some puppeteers and some people walking back and forth between this wall, holding up models of real things. Behind those people, on a ledge at the back of the cave, there's a blazing furnace of fire. And what this is doing is it's casting the shadow of those silhouettes onto the back wall. So the people of the cave, the community, they think they're looking at real things, but what they're actually looking at is just silhouettes of real things. But they're none the wiser. So one day, one of the men in the cave, and bear in mind he'd been there for his entire life, he just assumed that the way in which he saw things was the way in which things actually were. His shackles had become rusty, they'd become damp, and one of them broke. And as one of his hands was now free, he was able to loosen up the other shackles that were keeping him bound. And it took him a little bit of time. He didn't want to look around, to see what else was going on in the cave, because he wasn't aware of what he was going to find. He didn't know, or he wasn't aware of what other perspectives there were of life. So eventually he stood up and he walked around the side of the wall where he saw the puppeteers, and they were walking back and forth with the symbols, the carvings of real things. And he also, for the first time of his life, cast his eyes in the fire. Now, he'd never seen anything so bright, because all he'd seen up until this point was just the reflection of the flames on the wall at the back of the cave. For him, that was his reality. But now he could see something else. So as he was standing, gazing at the fire, gazing at the puppeteers, he started to come to terms with this whole new paradigm, this whole new perspective, this whole new reality. Then two of the guards of the cave, they saw that he'd broken free of the shackles, so they came down, they grabbed him, and they took him up the cave and they cast him outside. Now, this was the guy's first time outside of the cave. He'd never been outside before. He could barely open his eyes. He was just about blinded by the sunlight. He'd never experienced this. Fresh air. There was trees. There was fields to his left. There was a city. There was buildings. There was cars and buses and trains and trams. People were going about doing business, going about their daily lives. They were on their smartphones, on Facebook. They were taking online courses in modern applied psychology, doing all this kind of thing. He didn't know that any of this had ever existed. He didn't know what any of it meant. It took him weeks, it took him months just to come to terms with this new reality that he was now facing. What he began to identify was that the carvings and the models that the puppeteers were marching up and down the wall, that were casting shadows onto the back wall, that the community perceived as being real things, were actually just carvings of the real things that he was now experiencing outside of the cave. So his intrigue got the better of him. He went for walks, he went into the local city, until one day he remembered his fellow companions in the cave. Oh my goodness, none of these people know what I now know. So he went back to the cave, he got back and he went back and rejoined his ranks, this time as a free man. He'd grown in his awareness of life and reality. So he sat back in the ranks. He didn't want the guards to see him and throw him out again. So he spoke to the guy on the left and the lady to the right, and he said, listen, see everything that you're looking at on the back of the wall. You think these things are real things, but they're actually not real things. They're just shadows that are being cast onto the wall, are a reflection of the carvings that a bunch of people, puppeteers, they're marching up and down this wall behind you, which you can't see. And there's a furnace behind, and you don't even know what the furnace is, but that's kind of like a fire. That's what's reflecting the light into the back of the cave that we think is real light. Well, it's not. The fire is the real light. That's casting shadows onto the walls, which are the things that we perceive as being real things. But none of this is even real, because outside of the cave, and remember, the people inside of the cave don't even know what outside of the cave means. Outside of the cave, all the models that the puppeteers have carved out of hand, they're just a reflection of real things outside of the cave. So you've got to understand, my friend, everyone here is completely trapped in this limiting perspective, false state of reality. Now tell me, how do you think the man's message would have been received? That's right, the guys in the ranks to the left and the right looked at him and said, have you lost your marbles? You've gone completely around the twist. They rejected him, they rejected his message. Why? Because he communicated the simple in the complex. I hope I've illustrated my point. My friends, all right, this is the allegory of the cave. Growing in knowledge is great. Growing in ideas, growing in comprehension is absolutely fantastic. But the process of learning is understanding that which we're learning so we can apply it, make peace with it before we even consider sharing it with others. This is the allegory of the cave. It's a fine story. If you do want to do any further research on Plato's moralistic way of thinking and outlook in life, the book that I would recommend is The Republic. All right, one of Plato's most respected and appreciated works. It's a book that I've read a number of times over the years, and it's one that I never fail to gain fresh new insights out of. This, my friends, gives us a foundation for psychological thought. So let us begin here.